The fluorescent lights hummed their steady drone above Mercy General's third floor as Hannah Clarke pushed the med cart down the corridor at 6:13 a.m., her rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the linoleum. 15 years. 15 years of 12-hour shifts, of charting notes at 2 a.m., of hands that had learned to move faster than her mind could think. Nobody noticed her. That was the point. She'd chosen nursing for the invisibility, a middle-aged woman with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, the kind of competent background figure that hospitals needed but never really saw. Her co-workers knew her as reliable. Steady. Quiet. They had no idea that those calloused hands had once held surgical instruments in a field hospital 70 miles from Kandahar, or that the thin white scar on her right forearm, shaped like shrapnel exit wounds, came from an operation so classified that her service record had been scrubbed clean from every database. The military had ordered her to disappear after that. To become nobody. She'd obeyed for 20 years. The back of her locker at Mercy General held a pair of worn combat boots, the leather cracked and desert-stained, laces frayed from use. She'd kept them hidden beneath her street clothes, running her thumb across the scuff marks sometimes during her breaks, when she sat alone in the parking lot with her coffee going cold. The boots were the only physical evidence that Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke had ever existed. This morning was unremarkable. She arrived at 6:02 a.m., clocked in at the nurse's station, reviewed the overnight reports, and began her rounds on ICU Bay 3. The hospital smelled like it always did, a chemical mixture of antiseptic and industrial bleach, with an undertone of something organic and wrong that only appeared in rooms where people were fighting to stay alive. The equipment beeped its measured rhythm. Ventilators wheezed. For pumps clicked and hissed. At 7:15 a.m., the paramedics brought in Major David Chen on a gurney, unconscious and bleeding. He'd taken shrapnel from a training accident at Joint Base Lewis McChord, a freak explosion during a demolition exercise gone wrong. Hannah didn't look up from the computer terminal as the ambulance team wheeled him past, but she heard Dr. Sterling's voice, sharp, authoritative, tinged with the arrogance that came from family money and board connections. Sterling had been the ICU director for 7 years, and in that time he'd built his reputation on two things: perfect outcomes that he took credit for, and a ruthless enforcement of hierarchy that made sure everyone beneath him stayed there. Trauma Bay 2, Sterling ordered, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the tile floor as he gestured for the paramedics. Level 1 activation. Get orthopedics and cardiothoracic on standby. Hannah finished her current documentation and moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. She began preparing the trauma bay, her fingers working through the setup by pure muscle memory, checking the ventilator settings, confirming the crash cart was stocked, positioning the bedside monitor so she could read the waveforms from anywhere in the room. Her body moved on its own. Her hands never trembled. Pain is data. Panic is luxury. Both were things she'd learned to metabolize 15 years before she ever became a nurse. Major Chen was transferred to the trauma bed. The paramedic gave the report: shrapnel wound to the left shoulder, possible pneumothorax, multiple lacerations, GCS score of 8 and dropping. 23-year-old male, active duty special forces, airway compromised, transport time 12 minutes from impact. Hannah began the initial assessment. Vitals first. Blood pressure 92/56 and falling. Oxygen saturation 78%. Heart rate 134 and climbing. She moved his shirt aside to assess the wound, and that's when she saw it. The scar. On his left temple. Small, curved, shaped exactly like the surgical stitch pattern she'd learned from a Navy trauma surgeon in a forward operating base. 20 years ago. In Marjah, Helmand Province. She'd stitched that scar herself. The boy had been 7 years old when they pulled him from the rubble of a collapsed building, his head split open and bleeding, screaming for his mother in Dari. Hannah had been wearing her field uniform then, her rank still visible on her collar, her hand steady as she held his head together and whispered to him in English because that was all she had. She'd told him he was brave. She'd told him his mother was looking for him. She'd stitched his temple with the kind of precision that came from 15 years of training before that, from classified operations and combat medicine courses and things that would never appear in any official record. The boy had survived. The building had been a Taliban compound. 3 days later, Hannah and everyone else who'd been there had been ordered into the desert and told they didn't exist anymore. Now that boy was a major in the Special Forces, unconscious on her gurney, bleeding out from shrapnel wounds, and she was a nurse at Mercy General Hospital in Portland, Oregon, watching his oxygen saturation drop to 76%. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. Her voice came out calm and clinical as she called out the vitals to Dr. Sterling, who was moving through the standard trauma protocol with mechanical efficiency. Continuing descent on O2 sat, Doctor. Breath sounds diminished on the left. Possible tension pneumothorax. Sterling nodded without looking at her. He was checking the wound himself now, his perfectly manicured hands moving through the assessment. Get me a chest X-ray and a trauma panel. Prepare for intubation. And Clarke, he glanced at her briefly, his tone already dismissive, don't get too attached. Major Chen here isn't family. That's the problem with civilian nursing. You will get emotionally involved. She met his eyes for exactly 1 second. Long enough for him to see her face was blank. Long enough for him to look away first because people like Sterling always looked away when they realized they'd stepped into something deeper than they understood. Yes, doctor, she said, and her voice was perfectly level. Soft. Deferential. The voice of someone with nothing to lose because there was nothing left to protect. As the trauma team worked, Hannah positioned herself at the head of the bed, her eyes on the monitor, her hand steady as she prepared the intubation equipment. Around her, the ICU was controlled chaos, the sound of urgent voices, the beep of the cardiac monitor, the hiss of oxygen delivery through a nasal cannula. She could hear Sterling's orders, the residents' responses, the paramedic finishing his report and heading back out to the ambulance bay. But she wasn't listening to any of that. She was watching Major David Chen's chest rise and fall, watching the scar on his temple, watching the way his unconscious body was fighting to stay alive. 20 years of not thinking about Marjah. 20 years of burying what she'd been. And now that boy, that 7-year-old boy she'd carried out of rubble, blood soaking through her uniform, his small hand clutching her shoulder, was lying on her trauma bed with his oxygen saturation dropping toward dangerous levels. The ventilator wheezed to life as Sterling prepared the intubation. Hannah anticipated each step before he called for it, the way she'd anticipated 1,000 things before anyone asked. The problem was that this kind of precision, this level of tactical awareness, wasn't something you got from nursing school. It wasn't the normal competence of a 15-year veteran. It was the muscle memory of someone who'd spent 20 years before that operating in places where mistakes killed people. Sterling noticed. He glanced at her as she positioned the sedation medication before he'd even asked for it, raised an eyebrow at the way she had the breathing tube ready at exactly the moment he needed it, her hands moving with the kind of fluid certainty that belonged to someone who'd done this 100 times in austere conditions with explosions happening outside the tent. You've done this before, he said. Not a question. I've assisted intubations many times, doctor, she replied, which was technically true if you counted the intubation she'd performed herself in Marjah when the actual trauma surgeon was 3 hours out and the patient was crashing. Just trying to anticipate needs. Sterling's jaw tightened slightly. He didn't like being anticipated. He didn't like feeling like someone in his unit might be moving faster than he was. But he was good enough at his job to recognize competence when he saw it, and he was smart enough to know that showing that recognition would diminish his authority. So he turned back to Chen and continued the intubation without commenting, his movements precise and efficient, and Hannah stepped back into the background where she belonged, watching from the periphery as they stabilized the major's airway, confirmed tube placement with the capnography reading, and got him sedated and breathing on the ventilator. Oxygen saturation began climbing. 78, 82, 88. By the time Chen was fully sedated and stable, his O2 sat had reached 94% and his heart rate had come down from 142 to 110. The trauma team dispersed, Sterling giving orders for CT scans and continuing fluid resuscitation, the residents moving to their next patients, the ICU returning to its baseline hum of machinery and vital signs. Hannah was left standing at Chen's bedside as the nurses from the evening shift began their handoff procedures. She looked at the monitor tracking his heart rhythm, watched the lines of his face that were different now than they'd been at 7 years old but still carried something familiar. The kind of tired that comes from carrying weight. The kind of calm that only appears in people who've already survived the worst. She reached down and adjusted his full line, her fingers moving with automatic precision, and that's when she realized her hands were shaking. Not trembling. Not fear. This was restraint. This was the physical manifestation of 20 years of secrets pressing against her skin, trying to break free, trying to tell someone that the 7-year-old boy she'd stitched in a combat zone was now a major lying in her ICU, and she had no idea what was about to happen next. Chen's wife arrived first, her footsteps quick and uncertain, the ICU doors hissing open at 1,415 hours. Hannah heard her before she saw her, the particular cadence of someone moving through a hospital for the first time, half running, half hesitating, as if speed might somehow change what was waiting at the end of the corridor. The daughter followed, maybe 16, her face a mirror of her mother's panic. Hannah was adjusting Chen's left chest tube when they appeared in the doorway, and she turned with the professional composure that had carried her through 2 decades of hidden wars, her voice pitched low and steady. "He's stable. The trauma scan showed no active bleeding in the abdomen or thorax, and his neurostatus is improving. He opened his eyes for 4 seconds about 20 minutes ago." She didn't say his name. She couldn't, not in front of his family, not with recognition sitting like a live round in her throat. His wife's shoulders dropped an inch. The daughter moved to the bedside, her hand hovering above his arm as if she might break him with a touch. Hannah stepped back, the ventilator's rhythmic wheeze filling the silence, and explained the drain volumes, the antibiotic schedule, the neurosurgery consult scheduled for 1800. Her hands moved with the precision of a technician, but her eyes lingered on the scar at his temple for exactly 3 seconds longer than professional protocol allowed. That's when Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway. He was tall and carried himself like a man who had never been questioned, his white coat immaculate, his stethoscope draped like a medal of authority. Sterling moved through Mercy General the way conquerors move through conquered cities, with the casual assumption that every space existed because he willed it into being. Hannah recognized the look in his eyes immediately. He was studying her. Not Chen. Her. She felt the calculation happen in real time, the institutional gears turning behind his expression as he registered her lingering attention, her careful explanations, the extra 30 seconds she'd spent at Chen's bedside when she'd adjusted his monitors during the family's arrival. In hospitals, attention equals liability. Attention equals documentation. Attention equals opportunity for someone like Sterling to reassert the hierarchy that Hannah's quiet competence had begun to threaten. "Mrs. Chen," Sterling said, his voice smooth as surgical steel, "I apologize for Nurse Clarke's somewhat excessive hovering. We maintain very clear boundaries here at Mercy General between professional care and emotional involvement." Hannah stood at the bedside, her hands resting on the bed rail with the kind of stillness that came from holding multiple firearms in high wind conditions. One measured breath filled her lungs. One exhale, controlled. Professional. Invisible. "It's concerning," Sterling continued, moving closer to Chen's wife with the practiced sympathy of a man who'd perfected concern the way others perfected tennis swings, when senior nursing staff form emotional attachments to patients. "It clouds judgment. I'll be personally reassigning your husband to another nurse this evening. Someone with better professional distance." Hannah wiped a single tear from her left eye, the only rebellion her body permitted, without breaking eye contact with Sterling. Her voice emerged devastatingly calm, each word placed like a surgeon places a retraction. "The best nurses always recognize when a patient needs closer monitoring. That's not attachment, doctor. That's assessment." Sterling's face flushed purple at the neck. "That is exactly the kind of insubordination I'm documenting, Nightingale," he said, using the derogatory nickname with deliberate cruelty, as if reducing her to a diminutive could retroactively reduce her competence. Chen's wife looked between them, confusion blooming across her features. The daughter stared at Hannah with something like gratitude, but Sterling had already turned away, his phone already in his hand, already making notes in his mental ledger of infractions and insubordination. He'd found his opening. That night, Hannah entered the break room with her lunch, the container of leftover rice and steamed vegetables that she'd prepared at 0530 while the darkness was still thick outside her apartment. Four nurses sat at the table, scrolling through phones, and the moment she appeared, they exchanged glances. The glances were perfectly choreographed, a silent communication that required no words. The boss was watching. Within 90 seconds, they gathered their things. Jennifer, who'd worked beside Hannah for 3 years, who'd borrowed her scrubs during a gastro outbreak, who'd sat in this same break room and talked about custody battles and student loans and the specific exhaustion that came from holding dying people while their families wept, Jennifer wouldn't meet her eyes. She just left. So did the others. Hannah sat alone at the table with her untouched lunch, her spine perfectly straight, her face expressionless. The room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness of recycled air conditioning. She could hear the fluorescent lights humming above her, the sound like distant electricity, like bees trapped in plastic. That was restraint. That was the physical manifestation of 20 years of secrets pressing against her skin. The third humiliation was public and calculated with the precision of a military operation. Sterling posted the weekly disciplinary report on the unit's main bulletin board, the one located at the entrance to the ICU, visible to staff, visitors, physicians, and anyone entering from the main corridor. In red marker, 3 lines of text that might as well have been accusations read aloud on a public address system. H. Clarke, it read, written warning for unauthorized overtime and excessive patient contact. Senior nurses should know better. Hannah read it while restocking the crash cart on the 1600 shift, her hand steady as she counted the epinephrine syringes, verified the defibrillator pads, checked the 4 gauges. Her colleague Marcus, a respiratory therapist who'd been friendly before Sterling's orchestrated isolation campaign, whispered as he passed, "Sterling's making an example of you." She didn't respond. There was nothing to say. The strategy was flawless, isolation created vulnerability, documentation created a paper trail of misconduct, and public humiliation created a prison of consequences. What Sterling didn't understand was that Hannah had survived worse. She had survived deserts where the temperature reached 127 degrees Fahrenheit and the enemy had thermal imaging. She had survived blood loss that should have been lethal. She had survived watching a 7-year-old boy pulled from rubble with his mother's blood on his face and the knowledge that she could never, ever tell anyone that she'd saved him. But that wasn't the worst part. That night, as Hannah sat in her car in the basement parking garage of Mercy General, staring at her hands on the steering wheel in the darkness, she understood what Sterling had actually accomplished. He hadn't just isolated her. He'd separated her from Chen. He'd made it impossible for her to be the primary nurse on his care without creating more documented infractions. He'd used the institutional machinery that existed to protect patients against her, turning her own competence into evidence of misconduct. Her hands on the steering wheel were the hands that had performed emergency thoracotomies in sandstorms over Helmand Province. Hands that had stabilized hemorrhaging at 17,000 feet in altitude, in darkness so complete that night vision couldn't penetrate it. Hands that had carried a 7-year-old boy out of rubble, his small body against her chest, his blood mixing with hers. Those hands were now prohibited from touching the one patient who mattered. She'd been invisible for 20 years. She'd chosen invisibility. She'd signed the paperwork that erased her service record, turned down the public ceremony, accepted a salary at Mercy General that was a quarter of what the military had offered as separation pay. She'd built a life on the assumption that her past could stay buried, that a civilian identity could replace a classified one, that she could be just a nurse without the ghost of who she'd been haunting every decision. 2 nights later, at 0200 hours, Chen's cardiac monitor produced the sound that would shatter that assumption forever. A single alarm. Sharp. Insistent. Not the normal warning beeps that accompanied patient movement or lead disconnection. This was the sound of a heart in failure. Hannah reached his room in 4 seconds, her assessment immediate and terrifying, muffled heart sounds barely audible through the stethoscope, distended neck veins like cords beneath the skin, blood pressure dropping in real time as the monitor displayed the falling numbers. Pericardial tamponade. Blood collecting in the sac around his heart. The CT scan had missed the bleed. 3 minutes before cardiac arrest. Maybe less. The code team was 5 minutes away, responding to a multi-vehicle accident in the ER. Sterling appeared in the doorway, his hair disheveled from the on-call room, confusion still blurring his features as reality oriented him. Step back, Clarke. Wait for the attending. Hannah's eyes never left Chen's monitor. He'll be dead in 2 minutes. She was already pulling the emergency pericardiocentesis kit from the crash cart, her movements precise and unhesitating. The sealed package came open with a single pull. The needle was right where it should be. Everything was where it should be. This was muscle memory transcending 20 years of pretense. This was who she actually was, unfiltered by scrubs or professional distance or the careful construction of a civilian identity. Sterling's voice rose, panic and outrage mingling together. That is outside your scope of practice. I am ordering you to step away from that patient right now. Hannah positioned the needle below the xiphoid process, her angle perfect, everything in her body knowing exactly what to do. Noted, doctor, she said quietly, the words coming from somewhere beneath the nurse, beneath the civilian, from the operator who'd trained for precisely this situation under moonlight in Marjah while artillery thundered in the distance. She inserted the needle. 50 milliliters of dark blood filled the syringe. Chen's pressure stabilized immediately. 82, 88. 92, normal rhythm returned to the monitor with the inevitability of fate. The attending surgeon arrived 30 seconds later, and he froze in the doorway. His eyes traveled from the syringe in Hannah's hand to the insertion site to her face, and she watched recognition bloom across his expression, the flash of someone understanding that what they were witnessing violated the normal laws of civilian nursing education. That wasn't technique learned in a university. That was combat medicine. That was the kind of knowledge that only existed when you'd done it under fire. Sterling's face went white, then flushed with the particular purple of rage mixed with opportunity. Everyone saw that, he breathed. You just ended your career. Hannah cleaned the insertion site with the detached efficiency of someone who'd just done the same thing in a combat hospital with sand blowing through the window and mortars landing close enough to shake the building. She said nothing. Chen's wife appeared in the hallway, tears streaming down her face, whispering thank you with the desperation of someone who'd just watched their husband's life reassemble itself. But Hannah knew what was coming. Sterling was already moving into the corridor, his phone already in his hand, his voice already urgent as he placed the call. Yes, I need an emergency board meeting. Tomorrow morning at 0700. We have a serious liability crisis. Yes. A nurse. No, I'm not exaggerating. The line went dead. Sterling turned back to look at Hannah through the window of Chen's room. He was smiling. And that's when everything changed. The cardiac monitor alarm pierced the ICU at 0200 hours like a scream. Hannah was in the break room, 3 floors down, when the overhead system crackled, code blue, ICU Bay 7. She moved before the announcement finished. For seconds. That's how long it took her boots to carry her from the break room to Chen's bedside, and in those 4 seconds she saw what the attending surgeon did not, the shallow rise and fall of Chen's chest, the muffled heart sounds on auscultation 2 hours ago that no one had documented, the progressive blood pooling in the pericardial sac around his heart like a fist closing inch by inch. Pericardial tamponade. Missed bleed from the shrapnel wound. His heart was drowning in its own case. The attending surgeon, Dr. Reeves, stood frozen beside the bed. The monitor showed electrical activity, fine lines still moving across the screen, but Chen's blood pressure was 52/31 and dropping. His lips were already turning blue. The resident was reaching for the crash cart when Hannah moved past both of them without a word. Muscle memory. Hands moving like they'd done this before, because they had, not in a civilian hospital, but in a field tent in Helmand Province with artillery thundering outside and a boy bleeding out on a torp. She was already pulling the kit from the crash cart. 18-gauge needle. Sterile field prep. The ultrasound machine wheeled in by a nurse whose name Hannah had never bothered to learn back when she was still allowed to teach anyone anything. "Step back," Hannah said. Not a request. A command that settled over the room like a dropped weight. Reeves didn't move. That was the problem with civilian medicine, everyone froze when the stakes got high. Hannah positioned the needle herself. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She'd memorized this anatomy on 7 different people in 7 different combat zones, some conscious, some not. Her fingers found the landmarks with the certainty of a pianist finding keys in the dark. The needle went in. The hiss of air. That's what people never talked about, that sound, like a breath being released. Like the patient was finally allowed to exhale. O2 sat climbing. 62 to 68 to 75. Chen's eyes fluttered open. His chest rose, genuinely now, not the mechanical gasping of a man suffocating inside his own body. The monitor found a steadier rhythm. His blood pressure ticked upward, 60 over 35, 68 over 40, 72 over 42. Not safe yet. Not stable. But alive in a way he hadn't been for minutes ago. Reeves was staring at her hands like they'd just solved an equation he didn't know existed. His voice came out small. You're not trained for that procedure. Hannah didn't look at him. She was already prepping the drainage setup, already doing the work that should have been his to do. 18-gauge angiocath, 1-liter bag normal saline, keep it flowing. The words came out flat, precise, like she was ordering breakfast. Like her hands hadn't just moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd performed emergency field medicine under fire. Get cardiothoracic here. He needs definitive repair. Now. One of the nurses moved. The other 3 stood motionless, watching Hannah's hands work with the confidence of a master surgeon who'd somehow been wearing scrubs as a disguise for 15 years. Chen's breathing steadied. His color improved from the blue-gray of a corpse to the pink of the living. The monitor traced steady lines, beautiful and rhythmic as a heartbeat should be. That's when Sterling appeared in the doorway. He stood there for 7 seconds, Hannah counted, the way she'd learned to count time in situations where every second meant a life, and she watched his face arrange itself into something that looked almost like satisfaction. Not relief. Not gratitude. Satisfaction. The look of a man who'd just watched someone hand him exactly what he needed. Everyone except Dr. Reeves and Nurse Clarke, Sterling said quietly. Out. The room emptied like water draining from a sink. Hannah kept working, kept her hand steady on the lines, kept her voice clinical. He's stable. Needs transfusion protocol and cardiothoracic consultation within the hour. Yes, Sterling said, moving into the space where the nurses had been. And we're going to need to discuss how that procedure came to be performed by someone without authorization. Hannah finally looked at him. Her eyes met his with the flat certainty of someone who'd already died once, 20 years ago, and was just going through the paperwork of the second time. She didn't blink. Didn't flinch. Didn't explain. Didn't apologize. She simply held his gaze and said, he was dead. Now he's not. Sterling smiled. Not a genuine smile, a smile like a knife unfolding. Yes. And that, Nurse Clarke, is the problem. He left her there with Chen, with the machines humming their electronic lullaby, with the blood pressure cuff inflating and deflating in its programmed rhythm. In the hallway outside, Hannah heard him on his phone before she'd even finished securing the second line. His voice was already moving, already working, already constructing the architecture of her destruction with the precision of a man who understood that institutions were weapons if you knew how to aim them correctly. By 0800, Sterling had called an emergency board meeting. By 1000, he'd made his calls to other hospitals, Portland Medical, Legacy Emmanuel, Oregon Health Sciences. His voice was concern incarnate over those phone lines, carefully worried, deeply professional. concerning behavior patterns, unauthorized procedures, boundary violations. The words that would follow Hannah like smoke. By 1200, there was an outside investigator from the State Nursing Board sitting in Sterling's office, reading through a file folder that contained her pericardiocentesis but somehow did not contain the fact that Chen would have been dead without it. The file contained her pattern of boundary violations, the night she'd sat beside Chen's bed when no one was watching, the moment Sterling had caught her lingering when she should have been elsewhere. The file did not contain that she was a skilled clinician with 15 years of spotless evaluations. The file contained what Sterling had decided to show them. By 1400, Hannah was sitting in the boardroom. 5 faces arranged across a table like jury members already certain of guilt. Sterling sat to the side, not at the table but somehow still the room's true center. He'd orchestrated it perfectly. Wilson owed him the cardiac wing funding vote, Torres needed his residency program patronage, MacDonald wanted his vote for chief of staff. This wasn't justice. This was institutional mathematics, and Sterling had been running the equation for 20 years. The board president, a cardiologist named Hutchinson who'd never run an actual trauma code in his life, read from Sterling's report in a voice that suggested regret he didn't feel. Gross violation of scope of practice. Insubordination. Pattern of boundary violations with patients. Performing a procedure without proper credentials during an emergency situation. Hannah sat with her hands folded in her lap. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain the med school training that predated her nursing degree. She didn't mention the 16 weeks of surgical trauma instruction she'd received from Navy doctors who could tell the difference between a salvageable patient and a body. She didn't say anything at all until Hutchinson finished speaking. Then she looked at each of them in turn, Wilson, Torres, MacDonald, the 2 others whose names she'd never learned, and she said simply, "I saved his life. I'd do it again." Sterling leaned forward. His voice was almost gentle. "That's exactly the problem, Clarke. You think the rules don't apply to you." She turned to look at him. 1 second. 2. 3. Then back to the board. "The rules kept me quiet for 20 years. I'm done with the rules." The board president's pen moved across his paper. The vote was formatted as a decision rather than a discussion. Within 18 hours, the letter came, immediate termination for gross violation of scope of practice. Her badge was confiscated. Her schedule was purged from the system. Her 15 years at Mercy General erased from the official record as if she'd been nothing more than a ghost moving through those hallways. She cleaned out her locker at 0600 on a Tuesday morning before the shift change, dumping her scrubs into a cardboard box, adding the photos she'd kept on the magnetic strip. None of them showed her face, just the hospital in different seasons. At the very back of the locker, wrapped in an old surgical towel, were her combat boots. She'd kept them hidden there for 15 years, the leather worn soft as skin, the laces still spotted with dust from Marjah. She held them for a moment, these boots that had carried her through classified operations and black site extractions and a mission so buried that even her own military service had been officially erased from existence. She put them in the box. The military had ordered her to disappear after Operation Buried Angel. Had told her the mission never happened, her name never existed in any official capacity, her service was redacted from all records. She'd obeyed because the alternative was watching everyone she'd served with get burned along with her. But now she had nothing left to protect. No career. No credentials. No professional future in a system that had decided she was too much of a liability. She was still a patient, still nobody, still nobody, still nobody, until the call that was coming. Dr. Sterling moved with the precision of a man who'd spent 20 years weaponizing institutional power. Within 4 hours of Hannah's pericardiocentesis, he'd assembled an emergency board meeting, 3 members who owed him favors from contract negotiations, a hospital administrator terrified of liability, and a compliance officer who'd never questioned him in her tenure. The fluorescent conference room lights reflected off his polished cufflinks as he spread the medical record across the mahogany table like prosecution evidence. She performed an invasive procedure. Needle decompression of the pericardium. "That surgical scope," he said, his voice smooth as diesel fuel. A registered nurse with 15 years of experience performs within established protocols. This wasn't established protocol. This was a catastrophe waiting to be documented. The board members exchanged glances. Sterling had already prepared them. They didn't know Hannah Clarke. They knew only what he'd told them: a liability, an emotional attachment to a patient, a boundary violation. One board member cleared his throat. The attending physician was present. Sterling smiled. The attending was frozen. Watched her do it. That's negligence paired with scope creep. He didn't mention that the attending surgeon had immediately recognized the procedure's necessity, that the needle had entered at precisely the second intercostal space where it belonged, that the hiss of air escaping from the pericardial sac had been the sound of a life being saved. Sterling had trained himself long ago to see only what served his narrative. By 0800 the next morning, while Hannah was still sleeping, Sterling was making phone calls. He dialed the hospital where Hannah's nursing license had originated 15 years prior. "This is Dr. Sterling, ICU Director at Mercy General. I'm calling regarding Hannah Clarke, who worked with you before joining our team. We're conducting a peer review and encountered some concerning behavior patterns. Nothing concrete, you understand. Just patterns." The voice on the other end became cautious, defensive. That was all Sterling needed. A seed planted. A whisper that would grow like mold in dark places. He made 3 more calls. Each time, the same vague phrasing, the same insinuation without allegation. Boundary issues. Unusual attachment. Beyond her scope. He was pouring poison into the wells of her professional reputation, one conversation at a time. The outside investigator arrived at 1200. Sterling had hired her personally, a compliance consultant with a reputation for finding what clients paid her to find. Her name was Patricia Valdez, and she possessed the kind of ruthless efficiency that made her dangerous. Sterling handed her the medical record and a summary he'd prepared, his words chosen with lawyerly precision. "I need documentation of gross violation of scope of practice. We're not trying to destroy her career. We're trying to protect patients." It wasn't a request. It was a directive wrapped in professional concern. Valdez had investigated hundreds of practitioners. She knew how this worked. You looked at the record, you found the problem, you documented it thoroughly, and you got paid. The truth was negotiable. The paperwork was not. Hannah sat at her kitchen table at 0530 the next morning, still dressed in yesterday's clothes, staring at nothing. Her phone had buzzed at 0245 with a text from the hospital's Human Resources Department, final termination paperwork attached. "Return all hospital property by 1600 today." She'd read the document once. Her hands had been steady. Her breathing had been controlled. The composure of someone who'd been trained to absorb catastrophic news without flinching. But something inside her had fractured in a way that all her military training couldn't repair, the finality of erasure wrapped in bureaucratic language. Gross violation of scope of practice. Unauthorized invasive procedure. Immediate termination of employment. 18 hours from Chen's crash to her firing. The speed of institutional violence. Marcus found her there at 0700. Her teenage son, who'd inherited her dark eyes but none of her composure, stood in the kitchen doorway with his backpack still on, having come straight from a friend's house where he'd been sleeping over. "Mom." He set his bag down slowly. "You okay?" Hannah couldn't answer. She looked up at him and saw a version of herself reflected back, the inability to help, the helplessness of watching someone you loved disappear. "I need you to go upstairs. Get ready for school." Her voice came out hollow. Marcus didn't move. He'd heard the hospital call yesterday. He knew. "Mom, what happened?" Hannah closed her eyes. "Everything. Go to school." By 1100, Hannah was sitting in the Portland Veterans Affairs Medical Center waiting room, her appointment confirmation slip in one hand, a form she'd filled out in the other, reason for visit, stress-related chest pain. It wasn't a lie. The weight pressing on her sternum had started the moment she'd packed the cardboard box with her things. The waiting room smelled like industrial disinfectant and the particular exhaustion of men and women who'd been broken and were trying to be rebuilt. A Marine with a prosthetic leg sat 3 chairs away, scrolling through his phone. An army sergeant with a service dog lay curled at his feet, the animal's presence the only thing keeping the veteran from coming apart. A woman in a navy jacket read a magazine without turning pages. Hannah recognized the look in their eyes, the 1,000-yard stare of people who'd seen things that couldn't be unseen. She'd treated this expression in field hospitals in Marjah, had watched young soldiers develop it after their first firefight, had learned to read it like a language. Now she wore it herself. Her box of belongings was still in her car trunk in the parking lot. Mercy General had confiscated her badge, cleared her locker into a cardboard box in front of 2 security guards as if she were being escorted out of federal court. The medical supplies were nothing: disposable instruments, a stethoscope she'd owned for 7 years, a pair of compression socks. But at the bottom of the box, placed by her own hands the night before, were her combat boots. The one she'd worn in Marjah. The one she'd been wearing when she'd lifted a 7-year-old boy, the boy who'd grown into Major David Chen, out of the rubble of a collapsed building, the boy she'd carried 3 kilometers through hostile terrain while rounds snapped past her head like angry hornets. The boots were scuffed, the laces frayed, the leather creased in the shape of her feet. She'd hidden them for 20 years, removed them from the military equipment box when she'd been ordered to disappear, told by command that Operation Buried Angel was being buried, that her service had never happened, that she would no longer exist. The fluorescent lights hummed the same frequency as every military hospital she'd ever worked in. Hannah had learned to recognize the sound, the electrical hum of 60 hertz, the sound of institutional life support. She sat in her plastic chair and closed her eyes, and the weight of 2 decades pressed down on her shoulders like a field pack loaded with stones. 20 years of silence. 20 years of erasing herself so thoroughly that even she'd started to believe the erasure was real. She'd saved a 7-year-old boy and been told to forget she'd done it. She'd extracted 43 people from a building before it collapsed and been told her actions had never occurred. She'd carried the secret in her chest like shrapnel, felt it shift with each breath, learned to live with a wound that nobody could see. A clerk called a name from the intake desk: James Patterson. An older man in a faded army cap stood slowly, his movement stiff with pain, and walked toward the back. The door to the clinical area hissed open and closed. Hannah watched it like she was watching an exit she could no longer take. Her phone buzzed. Marcus, texting from school. "Mom, where are you?" She didn't answer. She couldn't explain that she was nowhere, that she'd been nowhere for 20 years, that she'd forgotten how to be anywhere at all. A woman in an Air Force jacket sat in the intake area filling out forms. A man in a wheelchair waited with the patience of someone who'd learned to wait for everything. Hannah had treated all of them, in some form or another, had carried their pain as part of her own body. They didn't know her. Nobody would ever know her. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 23 minutes later when the automatic doors burst open and the waiting room changed. Marcus burst through the VA waiting room doors like he was carrying the weight of 2 decades of silence. His chest heaved with the exertion of running, his teenage face flushed with urgency, and in his trembling hands he held the wooden case. The one she'd made him promise never to touch. The one that held the part of her life that was supposed to stay buried. "Mom, they need to see these," he said, breathless, already moving toward the cluster of veterans in the waiting room before Hannah could stand. Before she could stop him. Before she could say the word no that died somewhere between her throat and her teeth. He opened it in front of them. The waiting room went absolutely silent. Ribbon spilled across the worn mahogany like silk poured from a pitcher. Stars caught the fluorescent light and threw it back transformed, brass and gold and the deep crimson of valor. The assembled veterans, men and women who'd spent decades in the field, went motionless. A former Marine with a scarred face rose slowly from his chair. A woman with a prosthetic leg stood. One by one they rose without speaking, without being told, the way people do when something true walks into a room and demands recognition. Hannah's jaw tightened. One measured breath. Major David Chen appeared in the doorway at precisely that moment, flanked by two officers in dress uniforms so sharp they could cut glass. His hospital gown was gone, he was in Class A dress blues now, the uniform of someone officially back in the world. His eyes found her across the waiting room with the precision of a targeting system, and his voice carried across the silence like it belonged there, like it had authority in this space. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. The words landed like a detonation. A Navy nurse at the intake desk, young, eyes wide, pulled up a file that should not have existed. That could not have existed. Hannah watched the girl's hand shake as she began to read, her voice strengthening as the official words took hold of her mouth. Medevac operations in Helmand Province. 23 confirmed extractions under active fire. Direct medical interventions during multiple humanitarian operations. 7 lives saved in a single night in Marjah? The nurse's voice cracked. She swallowed and continued, reading the words like someone reading a prayer book at a funeral. Lives saved under continuous enemy contact. Combat field medicine beyond standard protocols. Deployment of unauthorized emergency procedures in field conditions resulting in 0 casualty rate for extraction operations. The SEAL commander stepped forward. He was a man with eyes the color of winter water and a presence that made the air pressure change. His voice was deliberate, measured, giving each word the weight it deserved. Bronze Star Favela. Pause. Silence. 2 purple hearts. Another pause, the veterans' hands went to their chests. And a Navy cross. He let that sit for 3 full seconds. For the Marjah extraction. 43 people brought out. 43 lives. Including one 7-year-old boy who's now a major in this man's command. Chen's eyes glistened. A second officer in dress uniform, the shoulder boards marking him as a 2-star general, stepped to the front of the room. He held a folder with the classified markings still visible on the cover, and his voice had the clarity of someone delivering official truth. Operation Buried Angel was declassified this morning by direct order of the Pentagon. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke is being recalled to active duty as a combat medicine instructor at Naval Special Warfare Command, Coronado. Your country has asked me to thank you for your service, and to inform you that the work you do in this new chapter will save lives on a scale you cannot yet comprehend. He extended the folder. Your orders, Senior Chief. Hannah's hand moved to accept them. That quiet dignity was still there, still holding, but something had shifted in her spine, something that had been curved for 20 years had straightened. She was breathing differently now. Back at Mercy General, Dr. Sterling was finding out what it meant to be on the wrong side of institutional collapse. He'd been summoned from his home at 2:14 p.m. by the hospital CEO's personal assistant with a message that suggested urgency without specifying disaster. He drove to the hospital in his 12-year-old Mercedes, his mind already constructing narratives, already planning how he'd frame Hannah's termination as a matter of necessary principle. He parked in his reserved spot at 2:36 p.m. and walked through the main lobby with his usual measured pace. The news vans were already there. Sterling's footsteps faltered. 2 camera crews were setting up in the main entrance. He recognized the KOIN6 logos. His chest tightened. No one had told him about press. Protocol violations were internal matters. Medical decisions were confidential. This wasn't. The board president was waiting in the conference room with the CEO and 3 hospital administrators. Their faces were made of stone. The president didn't offer him a seat. On the mahogany table lay a printout, pages fanned like a deck of cards, and every page bore military classifications that had been officially cleared. Do you have any idea what you've done? The CEO asked. Her voice was ice. Sterling opened his mouth. Hospital policy requires. Your job was to manage the ICU, not to manage people's identities. The board president cut him off. She held up the pages. These were declassified 90 minutes ago. Navy Cross recipient. Combat field medicine instructor with 30 years of classified service. You fired her for saving Major Chen's life. a procedure she's performed in the field hundreds of times under enemy fire. Sterling felt the room begin to tilt. I was enforcing scope of practice. You were enforcing your pride, the CEO said. Wilson just texted me. He's withdrawing his support. So are Torres and McDonald. We're looking at 3 board resignations by end of day, a Wall Street Journal piece about institutional failure, and the Navy Times has already picked up the story. CNN is making calls. Sterling's phone buzzed. Then again. Then 3 more times in rapid succession, his allies, his network, evaporating like water on hot concrete. By the time he reached the hallway, he understood he was no longer a man with institutional power. He was a man who'd made a catastrophic mistake against someone whose real authority had been hidden all along. The announcement was scheduled for 5:36 p.m. Staff had been assembled in the main lobby under the pretense of an important hospital announcement. Sterling walked in to find cameras rolling, the board president at a microphone, and a military police officer in dress uniform standing to the side, absolutely still, waiting with the patience of someone trained to do difficult things. Major Chen was there. Marcus was there. And Hannah was there, near the back of the crowd, her eyes on his with that same steady calm that had driven him to distraction for 3 weeks. The board president's voice was official, final, and carried through every speaker in the lobby. Effective immediately, Dr. Richard Sterling is relieved of his position as ICU director for dismissal of a decorated combat veteran. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke served her country with extraordinary valor in circumstances we are only now permitted to acknowledge. This institution failed to recognize her service and failed to protect her from institutional retaliation. That failure is unacceptable. Dr. Sterling's employment with Mercy General is terminated. The military police officer moved forward. Not aggressive. Not angry. Just efficient, the way people do hard things when those hard things must be done. Sterling was escorted through the lobby while the cameras flashed and the staff watched in absolute silence. His shoes clicked against the tile floor. The sound echoed in that quiet like a drum beat at a funeral. He made the mistake of looking back at Hannah. She met his gaze directly, no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction, just the calm acknowledgement of someone who had always known who she was and had simply been waiting for the world to catch up. Her son stood beside her with his jaw set, and Major Chen had his hand on her shoulder in a gesture that spoke of debts repaid and honor restored. Hannah didn't smile. She didn't need to. She simply watched as the doors closed behind Sterling and he walked out into the Portland evening, where the rain was just beginning to fall. 6 months later, she stood in a training facility at Coronado with the California sun streaming through industrial windows and 30 Navy corpsmen watching her with the kind of attention reserved for people who've walked through fire and lived to teach it. Her worn combat boots were laced tight on her feet, the same boots that had carried her through Marjah, the same boots she'd kept hidden in her Mercy General locker, the same boots that had finally brought her home. Today we're covering emergency pericardiocentesis under tactical conditions, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd done it for real when lives depended on her hands being steady. Who can walk me through the anatomy? A corpsman in the front row raised his hand. Hannah nodded. This was her life now. This was her voice. This was who she'd been all along, finally allowed to speak it aloud. That evening, Hannah learned that Dr. Sterling had taken a position at a Portland community college teaching basic CPR certification classes for $15 an hour. His medical license was under review pending the hospital's formal investigation. His name appeared in the New York Times as a footnote to the story of institutional failure and institutional redemption, not the protagonist, never the protagonist, just the cautionary tale. She deleted the article from her phone without forwarding it to anyone. Some victories didn't require witnessing. Some men became irrelevant simply by being exposed to the light. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value, if you've ever kept quiet about who you really were, then you understand what this moment cost Hannah Clarke and what she finally earned. Not all heroes wear capes, some wear scrubs. And some wear both. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about the hidden strength of quiet people and the moment when the world finally sees them. Like this video if you believe in second chances and vindication. And comment, would you have stayed silent for 20 years, or would you have told your truth sooner? Thanks for watching.